Okay, it's 2:00. Go ahead and call our budget workshop meeting number 1 to order. Just want to thank you guys for coming out this afternoon on this Tuesday, May 12th, 2026 at 2 p.m. So first things first, I'm going to ask the council to make a motion to amend the agenda by removing item number 2, the 2026 to 2027 budget priorities post-survey results. Our finance director, Ms. Jewel Laster, has asked for that item to be removed. So okay. So motion
Could I
made.
ask why?
Okay.
Certainly. We did not want to hit you with 3 PowerPoints today. Wanted to leave a little bit of time for any discussion questions, so we're going to present that one at the next budget workshop.
So you figured it was way beyond our capacity.
But we didn't know if you just wanted to look at PowerPoints all day and that's it, you know.
I'm picking on you. That'll be fine. I'll second.
Okay, motion made by Mayor Pro Tem Baloo, seconded by Councilmember Bill Taylor. Any discussion on this motion?
I got a little discussion.
Yes, sir.
How many budget workshops are we gonna have?
There's-
We got 3 scheduled.
All right, the question is, why do we need 3?
Well,
The
there's,
third one would be if necessary.
yeah, would be optional.
Okay,
2 for certain, 1 option.
okay, because we need to start making decisions. We don't need to meet again, okay? I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Any other discussion? Okay. There's no other discussion. All that are in favor of amending the agenda for this motion, raise your hand. All right, it's unanimous. Also, Councilman Nathan Chambers is absent. He already had a pre-planned trip with his family, so he won't be here for this budget workshop or the next one on May 19th, but he will be attending the 3rd meeting, if we have one, on June the 2nd. Okay, so next item on the agenda is presentation of financial planning model, Charles C. Habliston V, First Trine Advisors Vice President.
And I just wanted to say that Finance has been working with Charles, and he likes to go by Chazo,
Okay.
for the past year, working on the capital and financial planning model with him. And I won't go into details about what all he does because he's getting ready to do that.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Mr. Habliston.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for having me out. I'm Chazo Habliston with First Trine Advisors. We are based out of Charlotte, and we are a financial advisory firm that represents local governments all throughout the state, cities, counties, towns, assisting with capital and financial planning and debt issuances. As Jewel mentioned, we've been working with Morehead City for about a year now, developing, refining, and updating a financial planning model with the goal to help you all look out into the next 3 to 5 years, determine where do you want to be financially, what capital projects you want to tackle, and how do we get there. And so we wanted to focus my discussion today on that capital planning aspect. Start off with just a little bit of overview of why is capital planning important, and then more so dive into the model that is at your all's disposal. It's a tool that is now available for you all to leverage throughout the budget process, but also just generally throughout the year as questions come up about funding capital projects, funding operational needs. What does this do to us today and in the future? Just want you all to know that this is now at your disposal, and Jewel and Leanne will be able to leverage that when you all ask those questions. So starting out, why is capital planning important? The GFOA puts out guidelines as to why they feel capital planning is important. And what it really boils down to is it allows you all to properly plan for and deliver services to your citizens. By having a forward-thinking approach to your capital needs that are on the horizon as well as your operational needs, you can strategically plan for those projects and execute them in a scheduled, prudent manner that doesn't jeopardize your financial health. And so you all know that you have critical needs that are coming up. You have maybe other projects that you'd like to get done if funding materializes. And without a well-thought-out capital plan integrated into a financial model, it's hard to marry up those pictures and make sure that what you are trying to tackle is being done so in a fiscally prudent manner. From our perspective and from what we see throughout the state, capital planning is very important because what it does is it sets you up not only for financially responsible decisions, but oftentimes when you're issuing debt, you have to go through the local government commission, you have to seek funding from a bank. If you all were to ever seek funding in the public markets and obtain credit ratings, they're going to look at where's your financial picture been historically, where is it going in the future, what are your capital needs, how do all of those play in together, and effectively is Morehead City doing what's best for you all, for your citizens, but also not jeopardizing your financial health. And so putting that financial plan, that capital plan together, allows you all to take anything and everything into consideration and know that you're making very informed decisions. So when you think about kind of the capital planning process, well, it starts by gathering a list of what capital needs you have on the horizon, whether that's coming from department heads or if there are particular projects that council feels passionately about, and making sure that those are getting addressed. Then you think about, excuse me, what are the local government commission requirements in order to get those capital projects funded? And they look at fund balance levels every time you present an audit. There's certain state statutes, what funding sources are available, debt funding, pay-as-you-go funding, grant funding, taking all of that into consideration, and then figuring out what are the timing of the projects and how do those marry up with our available funding sources, our available resources that we built up in terms of fund and cash balances, our available resources in the current budget year, and what does it mean on a forward-looking basis. And then sometimes capital projects lend themselves to a potential general obligation bond referendum. So a lot of planning needs to go into that aspect to get you all to that referendum date before you could even consider additionally issuing general obligation bonds. And so kind of meshing all of that together, you start to develop this cohesive and transparent plan that gets buy-in from staff, gets buy-in from the elected officials, and then you start to take action upon that process. So you know what's coming up over the next 3 to 5 years. You know you can take on these projects in a relatively scheduled out manner. You're not overburdening staff with too many projects that they have to manage at one time. And ultimately, we're not jeopardizing that financial health. So as Jewel alluded to, over the past year or so, we've been working with staff to develop this capital planning and financial planning model. It was built out about a year ago today or so. And over the past year, we've continued to move it forward. The nice thing about a model like this, it's an ever-living, breathing document, so it doesn't look like what it did a year ago. It's going to continue to move forward, deliver the information and results that make the most sense to you all. And so what goes into a capital planning model of this nature? Well, we start by establishing your financial performance. Where have you all been historically in terms of fund balance levels, revenue and expenditure trends? Are you measuring up against your policies and your peers as you wish to do so? Then we look at what existing debt do you have on the books? How does that pay down year over year? When does that debt pay off entirely? And does freeing up of those dollars allow you to repurpose them for new operational needs or new capital needs to hopefully mitigate impacts to your taxpayers or to your ratepayers? And then we layer on your capital improvement plan, as well as any absolute critical needs, wants, or wish list type projects, with a goal being how far down can we get, or how far down the capital improvement plan list can we get before we start to violate any parameters or guardrails that we've set in place. And then lastly, we're keeping an eye on what we call your credit profile, making sure that if there's ever a time when you need to borrow funds, your financial picture is strong enough that a bank or a public investor would want to lend to Morehead City. So that's the input side of the equation. On the output side, what we're focusing on, depending on which fund we're paying attention to, in your general fund, what does your property tax rate need to be to support operations, to support these capital projects, to hit our financial policies and targets? On the utility side, what do our water and sewer rates or solid waste rates need to be for that same purpose? And then we're tracking fund balance and cash balance levels to make sure that you're hitting any financial policies or targets, you're not going below any peers that we like to benchmark ourselves against, and also keeping in mind the levels that the local government commission wants you to keep so that you're not getting a call from the local government commission when you release an audit and they're asking you why you all are depleting your fund or cash balances. As I touched on earlier, we're keeping an eye on your credit profile. If you're ever to have a public credit rating, we would make sure that any plan of finance that we're putting forth doesn't jeopardize a potential, or doesn't create a potential downside or downgrade scenario. If you don't have a credit rating, we're still keeping in mind how you all would be viewed from a bank perspective every time you need to seek funding from a bank. And then those peers, we like to benchmark a place like Morehead City against geographic peers, population peers, or other peers throughout the state that have similar characteristics to see do we have too much fund balance? Do we have too little fund balance? Do we have too much debt or too little debt? So that we can see where we are today and where we're projecting to go in the future, and to make sure that we're not getting out of line with that peer set that we're developing. And then ultimately, we're tracking just general revenue and expenditure performance. At an absolute minimum, we want to make sure that our recurring revenues are covering our recurring expenses, whether that's operating and maintenance expenses, salaries and benefits, existing debt on the books. But in an ideal world, we're leaving some dollars after covering those operating and maintenance expenses and debt service expenses for future capital needs, so that your current revenues are supporting everything that you have on the books today, but also providing you that avenue to fund future capital projects without having to make adjustments to a property tax rate, for example. And then we're also keeping in mind that as your expenditures grow year over year and your fund balance policy is based off of expenditures, we actually need to naturally have some growth in our fund balance just to keep pace with our expenditure growth to ensure that we're not violating that 30% policy. So that's at a very high level what the capital planning model is and what it does. Here's just a quick snapshot of some of your other peers throughout the state that have leveraged this model, just so you can see there's cities and towns very small, as small as Bald Head Island with just a few hundred people. There's entities like Wake County and Mecklenburg County that are the largest of the large in the state, and anywhere in between. And what that does is it gives us a good perspective on the challenges that any and all types of local governments throughout the state are facing, and how they're approaching tackling those challenges. One of the beauties about this capital planning model is we get questions from councils, boards, staff, all throughout the year about, can the model do this for us, or can it do that for us? If we do it for another one of our clients and it makes sense to add into Morehead City's model, we go ahead and do it, because we want to make sure that this is as forward-thinking as possible. It is only as good as the inputs and information that we put into it, and we want to make sure that the outputs are as meaningful to you all as possible. So from there, I wanted to give you all just a couple screenshots of what your model actually looks like. And at the end of my prepared slides here, I'd love to actually pull up the model so you can see it live and in action. We feel that the model is best used when it is done so in a setting like this, where you all as council can give us directions on assumption changes to make, or adjusting a project out a year or up a year, and seeing instantaneous feedback from that model, versus us coming before you all with a preset set of scenarios on paper. You all digest it and say, well, can you make this assumption change? I think this project is going to be $5 million instead of $6 million. And then we have to come back to your next budget work session and present that information. The model is best leveraged in a live capacity, where you all can quickly cycle through those what-if scenarios and hopefully expedite your decision process. So what I've got up on screen here is a sample snapshot of what we call your general fund tab within the model. And so this general fund tab tracks all of your general fund related revenues, expenditures, transfers in and out of the fund, debt service payments, capital projects, fund balance levels on not only a historical basis, but a forward-looking basis. And so we spent a lot of time with Jewel and Leanne building out the projection side in terms of looking at our revenue history, seeing how that has trended historically. What does that mean for us on a projection basis? What should we grow particular revenues or expenditures year over year? On the expenditure side, if there's new staffing needs that are coming up in a fiscal year or two, we want to make sure that we're layering those in. And ultimately keeping an eye on what is our fund balance tracking at year over year, because that's one of the main punchlines of the model. We want to make sure that everything we're putting in here doesn't jeopardize that financial policy or financial health. In addition to building out each particular fund within the model, we then start to layer on capital projects. And so these can be absolute critical needs, all the way down to wish list type projects, where you might say, if we had the funding capacity to do so without having to adjust our utility rates or our property tax rates, we'd love to get this project done, but it is not an absolute necessity. And one of the beauties of the model is you can turn projects on, you can turn them off to quickly cycle in whether or not that particular project is affecting your model. You can change the timing assumption, you can change the funding amount, the funding type, whether it's debt, grant, cash funding. If it's a debt issuance, you can quickly cycle through between amortization terms, interest rates. All of it updates on the fly so that you can quickly and instantaneously see those impacts and results. From there, once we've kind of built out all of the kind of guts of the model, so to speak, if we feel comfortable about our operating projections, we've started to layer on our capital projects, the model then gives us outputs that we can start to digest and make decisions upon. And And so this output page here provides an overview of the 3 different funds that we're tracking. The left set of columns is the general fund. We put a focus on what is your property tax rate, where do we think your tax base is going to grow year over year in between revaluation cycles and in those revaluation years. We can assess what's the right tax rate to set in those revaluation years. Is it revenue neutral? Is it rate neutral? Is it somewhere in between? And doing so in the context of a 3 or a 5-year projection period helps give you all the context of, let's not necessarily make a decision just to satisfy this year's budget, but we recognize in 2, 3, 4 fiscal years that we have large capital projects. So maybe we're setting the property tax rate today that'll get us through our next revaluation cycle, tackle all the projects and operating expenditures that we want to cover, and not have to touch the tax rate again until we get to that next revaluation year. And then we're tracking fund balance levels and benchmarking it against your policies or targets. You'll see a few cells that are shaded in reddish orange. What those are meant to do is give us a quick eye indicator that we have violated some parameter or guardrail that we've set in the model, and it tells us either we digest that information and feel that we're comfortable with our projection going below our 30% fund balance level for a particular year, or if we're not comfortable with what that projection is telling us, we need to take some corrective action, whether it's adjusting our expenditures to bring those down, pushing out or taking out capital outlay, or conversely, maybe trying to grow revenues faster, whether it's sales tax revenues or adjusting our property tax rate. There's a whole host of combinations that you can work through to get to your end result. And one of the things that the model allows you to do is cycle through those different iterations, play with the different variables, and ultimately get to a picture that you all are comfortable with. And it's the same story for your water and sewer fund, which is in the middle, or your solid waste fund, which is out to the right. So all of this information here is presented in a tabular format. Might be a little bit hard to digest just because there's a lot of numbers on the pages. So we also like to translate that information into general graphic format, which kind of allows you just to look left to right and glean some trend line analysis of what are these graphs telling us versus actually having to look at hard numbers. So there's a whole host of graphs within the model. I've just given you all one snapshot. But with all the data that's built into the model, we can create any graph that might be meaningful to you all as a council. So just as a couple of examples here, the top left graph, the blue bars represent existing debt that's on the books today. How do those pay year over year? It might be a little bit hard to see, but stacked on top of those blue bars, there's some lightish gray bars. That's what we call proposed debt. So if there's any capital project that you all are considering debt funding, you can see how that new principal and interest payment stacks on top of existing debt that you have on the books. The top right graph shows a trend analysis of are we adding to or subtracting from fund balance or cash balances in a given year. So our projections showing that we're going to draw down fund balance to fund this capital program and plan of finance that we put forth, or conversely, is it giving us surpluses each year that we could leverage or perhaps look to add additional expenditures or adjust our revenues accordingly. That top right graph works hand in hand with the bottom left graph, which is benchmarking your fund balance levels against your 30% policy target to make sure that we're meeting that year over year. If not, then we can see that the green line intersects the gray line, and that tells us we're now going below that 30% threshold. And then the last graph on the bottom right is just a hypothetical. What would a property tax rate need to be year over year to hit our financial goals and maintain that 30% fund balance level? Another snapshot in the model here is what we call our projection summary. So trying to give you all a very high-level overview of where do the next 5 or so fiscal years look like based on our assumptions, and trying to keep it to relatively limited but meaningful information in terms of revenue analysis, trend analysis, cash balance or fund balance levels. This is for a water and sewer fund. We have it for your general fund and your solid waste fund as well. But really trying to extract all of the detail from the model and summarize it up to a very high level so that you can still see relevant information to you but not have to get bogged down in all the nitty-gritty that goes in behind this information. And then lastly, as I touched on earlier, we have built into the model peer comparisons where we can look at any and all peers throughout the state, pull their audited financial information, create their specific ratios, whether it's fund balance levels or debt levels, and then benchmark where you all are today and where you all are projected to be in any future fiscal year. And so that just allows us to have somewhat of a strength in numbers approach where maybe we want to make sure that our fund balance levels or our debt levels are around the midpoint of this peer set, or if we happen to get too high or too low compared to our peers, we recognize that maybe we need to take some corrective action out into the future, or if our fund balance is much higher than our peers, maybe we have the ability to draw some of that down to fund capital projects, to take a potential debt financing out of the equation. So all of this information is integrated into the model to allow us, again, to make informed decisions with anything and everything that could impact you all from a financial perspective, so that when you all are thinking about adopting a budget or you're thinking about adopting a capital plan, you know that you're doing it kind of with a nod to the future and not just maybe looking at it from a budget year to budget year perspective. So that is all that I had from a prepared slide perspective. As I mentioned, I have the model. I'm happy to show you all kind of how it works live, not necessarily asking you all to make any decisions, but just get you all oriented to what the model looks like, what it can do for you all. But maybe before I do that, I'm happy to pause. I recognize I just talked for 20, 30 minutes, so happy to take any questions, comments, thoughts that you all have.
Sir, when I look on page 8, projected impact of outputs,
Yes, sir.
and I see the orange under general fund goes below our, I'm going to call it our safe level, in 2028 at a projected tax rate of 34.25. How good are those numbers being true to Morehead City? Or are these numbers you've inserted just for illustration purposes and not generic to Morehead City?
So I would say it's a little bit of both. So the fiscal 2027 year is based off of your current preliminary budget, and then everything 2028 and beyond is projected off of that budget. So the baseline for 2027 is true to what you all are considering for this upcoming budget cycle. Then on a forward-looking basis, if there's conservatism built into the budget, we're inherently compounding some of that conservatism year over year. You're likely to have some lap salaries, for example, that's going to bring down that expenditure budget, probably a little bit conservative on your revenue projections, and so hopefully there's budget outperformance that way as well. We don't always like to build in, or I should say, pull out that conservatism within the model, because there's a chance you hit your budget as it's presented, and there's a fund balance appropriation for capital within your budget as it stands right now. And so what that tells us is, unless there is budget outperformance from a budget to actual perspective, there is a possibility, it's not guaranteed, but there is a possibility that you all could be drawing down fund balance out into the future. And so there's ways to work around that, whether it's trimming back capital or quantifying what kind of outperformance you need to hit in order to fix that red light that you all are seeing in 2028 and beyond. But we like to start on a conservative basis just to show you, here's likely the worst case scenario. If you all hit your budget as it is in 27, that kind of stays true out into the future. This is what the projection would look like. Obviously, not a sustainable projection, not something that you all would actually operate under, but just a kind of a heads up that here's a scenario. And then we use the model to work out how can we potentially fix this scenario. So it could be adjusting your tax rate, it could be scaling back capital, it could be reducing expenditures, some combination of that to get there, but just kind of a red light indicator to say, here is a potential option or potential scenario that could play out, and there would likely need to be some changes that would have to be made in a future budget year to correct for it.
Then, using your comments today, to think about what I'm about to hear for the next 2 or 3 meetings, however budget number we have, am I safe to say that I need to have in the back of my mind that by 2028, at a tax rate of 34.25%, unless we adjust our operating expense or come up with more revenue, we're going to be in jeopardy of falling below our fund balance objectives?
Yes, with maybe 1 or 2 caveats.
Okay.
So that assumes that in fiscal 2027, you all appropriate about $2.2 million for capital, and it assumes that all of that money is spent and you hit your budget nail on the head. So said another way, if you fast forward to the end of your fiscal year 2027 and your budget plays out exactly as it is currently prepared, you would draw down $2.2 million of fund balance solely for capital projects. So if that played out and you're sitting in your seat this time next year, then yes, you would be looking at a potential scenario where you could be dipping below your 30% fund balance level at the current tax rate, and assuming some relatively conservative growth assumptions based on all the revenues and expenditures within your budget today.
So if I'm a conservative person, and I don't think we're gonna do anything foolish or, overspend or underspend, hit the numbers, then this is a caution to me that we need to have in the back of our minds our plan for 2027, and also focus that 2028 and beyond is getting a lot tighter. So our goal for having a 2-year projection of budget, in that second year, we have to think about being even more conservative, and that reductions in the tax rate may not be possible,
Provided you want to maintain the same level of services. But yeah.
providing everything works out. I got that.
Yep.
That's not good news. Thank you.
I would say it doesn't look like good news, but there are numerous other local governments out there that do these conservative projections and often outperform. And so when we're updating the model on a semi-annually or annual basis, it oftentimes, the picture starts to correct itself. It might look a little bleak in years 2, 3, 4 right now, but if we fast forward a year from now, everything might continue to slide out a year, and you're outperforming your 26 estimate, you're outperforming your fiscal 27 budget, and that kind of resets our starting point.
You made a statement, you said that, that this instrument would help us. Can you kind of summarize some ways that this will assist us?
Yes, absolutely. So during the budget cycle is when we're very active in leveraging a model of this nature. And so a couple of different ways it can help. Obviously on the capital planning side, you can figure out what capital projects you want to fund, when you want to fund them, and are they affordable within your current revenue streams, your current fund balance levels. Tangentially related to capital projects, we want to keep in mind that oftentimes capital projects have operational impacts to your budget. So think, for example, if you're building a new fire station and it's a complete addition to your fire department services, you're going to need to staff that up. You're going to have additional operating and maintenance expenditures, utilities. So the model captures the capital costs, but also captures the operating impacts that come along with it. During the budget season, if you have staff, department heads that come forth with additional staffing requests, you can layer those on as potential impacts. If we want to plunge 2 new firefighters or 2 new police officers and they cost an aggregate of $120,000 a year, you can see what that does in this year's budget and every year thereafter without creating that additional recurring revenue, what it might take to get to fund those additional staff members. You have other options, like if you ever conduct a salary study and that company comes back with 3 different salary study options, you can quickly cycle through what does it look like if we implement option 1, 2, or 3 of that salary study, and what revenue do we need to generate to afford that going forward. And then lastly, when you are in those revaluation years, it allows you to look at the various ways that you could set your property tax rate to meet all of your goals today and into the future, so that you know that the property tax rate you're setting today is appropriate for the next couple of years on the horizon versus just addressing this budget cycle.
Mr. Halberstam, I have a question. First things first, how much is this financial planning model going to cost?
So the town has already paid for it. You all paid for it, I believe, at the end of last fiscal year.
Yeah.
If memory serves, I think it was $20,000 to deliver the model. And then on a forward-looking basis, it's just an hourly contract every time you all need to use our services. We are just tracking our time into this model. So it's something that I have briefed Jewel and Leanne on, and they are very comfortable running with it. So I can be as involved or as uninvolved as makes sense from a finance perspective. But the cost for it to be built out has already been paid for, and so now it's just in the servicing mode.
Okay, and this model is going to align with our strategic plan goals?
Yes, absolutely. So we want to make sure that it is delivering on those strategic plan goals. It's not deviating from it. Anything that you all have in mind from a strategic plan perspective that has a financial impact to Morehead City would be built into that model.
Mr. Mayor, Council, if I could interject, I came late to this item in particular, late. I apologize for that, but I started 10 days ago, so I guess I shouldn't be apologizing for it. But in any event, I've had good discussions with Jewel and Daniel and in my volunteering efforts before I started. I'm looking forward to getting more in-depth into this, but I think it's a very useful tool that obviously a lot of our peers discovered earlier than we did here. And I've heard from some members of the council, even during our early discussions since I've been here, that this is something that some of you have been eager to see when capital projects particularly come before the council, to have some way of, without having to reinvent the wheel and spend a tremendous amount of staff time. This model, as I understand it, will allow you to project those things, and you'll have more immediate access to that data, which will help you make better informed decisions on future capital projects. And rather than wait and see how it impacts in the budget time, you'll know ahead of time. And it will be incumbent on the staff to also provide the initial study and analysis of what kind of staffing impacts are anticipated from new facilities or expansions or upgrades that are going to be impactful on service. I think it also should be helpful to us, as was pointed out in the presentation, when we go to the markets or financing sources, we'll be better prepared to evaluate those resources and determine and know what the impact when citizens or others are asking, or financial institutions for that matter, what is this going to do to your current operating budget and going forward for the foreseeable future. So I see a lot of potential benefits from this, particularly with our very capable staff getting comfortable and doing as much of it as they can on their own without relying on the services of this firm that's helped us build the model or brought it to us. I think that's going to be another big value. So I don't know if you want to add anything, Joel. Hope I didn't screw that up too much.
No, I want to say that Leanne has already been working heavily in this and is very comfortable and has actually done a little bit of reprogramming on her own. And her and Chazvo have worked together to make sure that, you know, the changes that we've made are working through it the way they should be. So I will say that Leanne definitely knows the ins and outs of this. At times, we would definitely want to work with Chazzo and his special knowledge as to making sure that we are doing it the way, you know, it should be done. I didn't know if you guys were wanting to see an example run through some scenarios, because I think it would be really good to see it in working.
Yeah, I think that'll be a good idea.
Yeah.
Sorry, it sounds like I have a horse in my throat.
Yeah, I was gonna say if that's possible, that would be preferable. Thank you. Okay, so this is Morehead City's model that we have built. And so this is the live working model that I took some screenshots out of and put into that presentation. But just to orient you all, at its core, it is an Excel-based spreadsheet, but there's a number of different tabs along the bottom that are all interconnected, so that when you make assumption changes in one particular place, it's impacting the model appropriately in every area that it needs to do so. And so a lot of the information that I extracted and put into the presentation is based off of this dashboard tab, which is generally where in budget workshop sessions we spend the majority of our time cycling through projects, cycling through different scenarios, and ultimately determining what the appropriate impact or outputs are shaping up to be. And so to one of the council members' questions earlier about, you know, this fund balance level, you know, dipping below our prescribed 30% target starting in 2028 and carrying out into the future. There's a number of different ways to kind of fix that picture, so to speak. I'll just give you one example to show you some of the functionality of the model and to allow you to see how quickly we can arrive at a potential result, not saying that it's the only result or the right result to go with. But start out, again, we have your 2027 preliminary budget loaded in there, and that is our starting point for all projections going forward. We have your current 5-year capital plan as it's scheduled out to be paid. I think it's about $6 million or so from fiscal 2028 and beyond. And so, as an example, if I were to strip out all capital outlay for 2028 and beyond, what that'll start to do is it'll start to fix our picture. So, where we were effectively going down to zero fund balance in these out years, we're now bottoming out at about 20% or so, depending on the fiscal year. And so, effectively, taking capital out of the equation from fiscal 2028 and beyond helps the picture. It doesn't get us all the way there. And so, another example would be if we try to take this a step further and say, what would our property tax rate need to be today and in the future to cover just operations and just existing debt on the books based on the projections that we have going forward. So if I look at fiscal year 2028, and if I change that from 34.25 cents, excuse me, to 35.25 cents, so a 1 cent tax adjustment, you'll see that that fixes our picture. And what it does is it effectively levels us out at that 30% mark. And so what that tells us is that is the appropriate tax rate to cover operations out into the future, but it leaves us very little room for capital going forward. So depending on the capital priorities, the absolutely critical needs that need to get funded, we can start to put those projects back into the model and figure out where do we need to go from a revenue or adjust our operating expenditure perspective to get us to back to where we need to be. Another example I touched on earlier, while I've corrected this picture here, if we look out to your next revaluation year in 2030, if for example, the county is telling you all that it's going to be another 25% increase in your tax base, we can change that from a 5% to a 25%. And now, if you held your property tax rate steady there, you'll see that your fund balance starts to balloon year over year. And so that's where we can start to play, well, if we're going to get a 25% increase in our tax base, maybe our tax rate can go down to 28%, for example, or excuse me, that was 28 cents. That's a little bit too low, and so you can quickly cycle through what is the appropriate tax rate based on what we're hearing from the county in the next revaluation cycle to satisfy our parameters that we've set within the model. And so you'll see that all of these numbers we're kind of updating on the fly. Similarly, all the graphs out here are adjusting as we're making assumptions, and so it gives us that instantaneous feedback when we're thinking about big ticket items within the budget cycle, whether it's those capital projects, whether it's funding additional staff, salary studies, revaluations, anything of that nature that has a really big impact in how you all are looking to shape your budget. You can quickly work through those scenarios in a model like this and hopefully narrow in your decision tree to maybe a few different options versus too many options that are on the table and making it hard to decide where to start from. And so that's just a general orientation of the model. I'm more than happy to take any questions, or if you say, can the model do this for us, I'd love to answer that and hopefully show it for you, show it to you. But again, remember that this is something that you all now own. It's at Jewel and Leanne's disposal. So when you all come to them with questions about, can we fund this capital project, or you've adopted your budget and 6 months from now something that materially has changed, whether it's an economic downturn starts to shape up and you're thinking that sales tax is going to tail off, well, we go into our sales tax projections and bring that down from current year estimates and now see what the model is telling us and what does it mean for the future of Morehead City. So anything that can be a financial impact to you all is something that can be built into this model and considered year to year or intra-year, depending on when the question or the need arises.
Any other questions?
So it's been pretty easy to work with? Okay. Happy?
Yeah. We are.
As I was pointing out earlier, if I could interject, this is real-time ability to do your projections, and again, without waiting, as he pointed out, to another meeting to find up an update. You'll know right away what, if it's a suggestion to do this or that, what the impact will be. And as the city's operations have grown significantly since my last venture into budgeting here, this is the kind of thing you need at this level to be able to accurately project, not speculatively. So it's very helpful. And going to Councilman Taylor's comments earlier and asking about projections into next year, we'll be able to do that in, let's say, in a workshop mid-year. You can sort of see how things are playing out or something, and see where we stand and make adjustments as needed for the remainder of that fiscal year, and more accurately than in the past, be able to project what the next year's budget situation is going to be. And that's really critical when you're talking about some major needs and decisions that the commission is going to be making going forward. We really need that capability. Thank you.
Can this tool be used to certify recommendations from another study? And what I have in mind is when we asked our consulting engineer to look at our water rates and give us a projection of, we gotta go up, 5% or something, whatever that recommendation can be. Can we run this type of thing in addition to it to see how close that projection might be?
I would say yes. Now, Tyndall's maybe working with some, assumptions about some future capital projects. So we would just want to kind of work with him to see what assumptions he's working with. But yeah, I don't see why that would not be possible with this model. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add on what I just flashed up here on the model. So we've built out your entire water and sewer rate structure. We've looked at your different customer classes, the number of customers within that class, your base rate structure, your volumetric rate structure. And so to your question, yes, the model can either validate those projections, or oftentimes you have a study done and it might be every 3 to 5 years that study is done, and you're kind of relying on that to carry you all till the next study. But oftentimes things change throughout that period, and so this model can allow you to be nimble in those in-between years and say, the study is our baseline, but since then, this project has doubled in cost, or it's gone off of our radar and we don't want to fund it anymore. And so you can make that adjustment and kind of start to work yourself away from that study and now make it more realistic to what's transpired since the study has been put in place.
So this is a tool that we can take more of the crystal ball out of our budget forecasting and our rate projection.
Yes, sir.
Sounds great.
Now, Mr. Hableton, as far as performance measures, like what type of performance measures are we going to use, like to know that this model is working for Morehead City, and financially we're in a good place?
Yep. So at a minimum, it's your policy that you all have adopted.
Yeah.
Then we're benchmarking you against peer sets.
Mm-hmm.
We're benchmarking you against where the local government commission expects you all to be. And then kind of from a model projection versus actual output, we're making sure that if we're looking at your 2027 year, for example, as a budget or as a projection, and then now we're coming back and your 2027 year has actually transpired, we're doing that look back to make sure that we weren't too aggressive or too conservative on our assumptions, that is steering you all to make a decision that would have been different if our assumptions were more honed in. So we like to make sure that we're kind of looking back from what our projections were telling us versus what has actually played out, to inform whether or not we're being too aggressive, too conservative, or if we're in the right spot, then we know that we can kind of keep along that path. Otherwise, we want to make some assumption adjustments so that the projection side is as close to, we think, your actual performance will be.
Okay, now what other financial indicators are there besides, you know, the fund balance?
So you can look at debt service as a percentage of expenditures, and so that is effectively saying how much is our principal and interest payments in a given fiscal year consuming our budget. Usually, the upper end of that threshold is anywhere from 15 to 20%. You can look at outstanding debt as a percentage of your assessed value. From a statutory perspective, the maximum is 8%. We don't see anyone ever get close to that, and so usually you'll see a benchmark of anywhere from 2 to 2.5%, and that's all on the general fund side. In your utility funds, there is a statistic called days cash on hand, which is very similar to a fund balance policy percentage, and so usually anywhere from about 270 days to 360 days, or call it 75 to 100% of your operating budget is within your cash position. There's one more called debt service coverage ratio, which is something that lenders will look at if you ever needed to finance something out of your water and sewer or solid waste fund. At its simplest form, that looks at your operating revenues. It backs out operating expenditures, and so that net revenue available for debt service number is what you are benchmarking to something ideally 1.25 to 1.5 times. So as a simple example here, if you had $1 million of revenue, $500,000 of operating and maintenance expenditures, that would leave $500,000 available for debt service. If you had $250,000 of annual principal and interest, you divide $500,000 by $250,000, your debt service coverage ratio is 2 times. And so we keep that in mind. It doesn't necessarily matter if you're not looking to finance anything out of your water and sewer or solid waste fund, but the second a financing comes into play, that's something that we're benchmarking you against just to make sure that you are creditworthy from a financial perspective, or from a lender's perspective, I should say. And so those are the general benchmarks, and then we are just kind of, excuse me, tracking overall revenue and expenditure performance. As I alluded to towards the beginning of the presentation, we want to make sure that at an absolute minimum, operating revenues are covering operating expenses. The last place you want to be in is a structural imbalance where you are relying on fund balance to cover ongoing recurring expenditures, because that's when you're going to have that gradual decline year over year. The LGC is going to come knocking and saying, hey, we've noticed that for the past couple fiscal years, your fund balance levels have deteriorated, and it doesn't appear to be due to one-time capital expenditures. So that is just a general performance indicator that we're tracking, but there isn't necessarily a benchmark other than ensuring that there is that coverage where operating expenditures are making sure that they're sufficient to cover those expenditures. Sorry.
So we'll be using internal and external benchmarks?
That's right.
Yeah, to compare it to like previous years?
That's right.
Okay.
And then to the extent you all ever sought a public credit rating, so there's Moody's Investor Services, Standard & Poor's, and another group called Fitch, we have the ability to build in their scorecard methodology into the model. So that would be another external indicator. If you all were ever to seek a credit rating, we now know what your credit rating is. We build into the model their scorecard methodology. All of the financial factors that impact that methodology are now flowing through your projected credit rating, so we know on a forward-looking basis, do our projections tell us that we're still steady at our current credit rating? Does it tell us we have potential upside, or could we seek an upgrade? Or conversely, are the projections that we're putting forward showing that we have downside pressure and now we're subject to a potential credit rating downgrade? So that's not applicable today, but it could be applicable into the future and something that we would just bolt onto the model if that ever came into play.
Yeah, and that would be something that likely would come into play if you had a major capital infrastructure improvement, like a new water plant, new sewer plant, or a major upgrade in the tens of millions of dollars, because obviously those rating agencies can, if you qualify and you meet that criteria, and that's the thing I really like about this, it gives you a snapshot of whether you really will benefit from it in the rating you'll get, because you may not qualify. And based on your financials, this already has all the information, so we don't have to go through, jump all those hoops to just figure it out. So you're ahead of the game before those things, but that is something that a lot of communities really benefit from if they're able to hit those benchmarks and get a rating that qualifies them for certain types of financing rates that are only available to highly rated agencies which all your larger cities and counties have that, but most of the municipals, I would imagine, do not. They never had when I was here, but Morehead may be getting into an area, particularly if we were looking down at something major that we wanted to do, or a string of major things. It'd certainly be worth our time to evaluate the likelihood that we could benefit from.
How true is the growth rate? I know in 26, you're using a 61.25%, and then 27, 9, and then you go to 28, 1. So how true is the growth rate in the scenario that you're presenting?
So that's in reference to, excuse me, the value of 1 cent on your tax rate. And so, sorry, I'm trying to get my mouse here for you all. The 65%, that is true based on the revaluation that was set at the county level. The 2027 9% is based off of what your preliminary budget is. And so the 1% in between is meant to be conservative. It's likely well below where you all would perform. But generally coming off the heels of revaluation, you don't see as much growth because the market has effectively reset itself in terms of the property values. And when you are selling a home, it is now in alignment with its actual tax value. And so it's more so incumbent on new growth within Morehead City. And, you know, sometimes there are clients that are relatively built out, and so that new growth may not be as available. And so this is more so probably conservative, might be more like 2 or 3% in reality, but we don't want to be in the alternative scenario where we're over-promising on our property tax growth, which is the largest number in your budget, those property tax revenues, and then we end up underperforming compared to projections, and now all of a sudden we're having to make some drastic adjustments to get back into where we want to be.
And that's consistent with my experience in working with finance directors over the years, and this one's no exception. They are very conservative in their projections, hoping to be surprised in a positive way, not the other way. So,
If you will go to the water fund on that chart.
Is this what you're asking about or different?
No, I'm looking at the chart on page 8, where it shows in the orange that we're already in orange, and our engineer has suggested that we're going to have to adjust our rate upward. Is that orange picture there telling us that we're already spending out of our cash reserve if we don't increase the rate?
Yes, but you're spending for capital purposes. I will say that while those are flashing as red, the magnitude that you're below our targets is relatively minimal, so I would not say that any of these are alarming. You know, we've got a 1.5 times debt service coverage ratio target. You're flashing below that briefly in 2028, I believe, for just 1 year. Your days cash on hand only drops below 270 for 2 years, and that's in 28 and 29. So this is likely a function of we're starting with your budget. There's conservatism in the budget. You're more than likely going to outperform your budget, and so this picture corrects itself. It'd be one thing if this was showing red in many more cells or many more data points, and that the trend was continuing to go down year over year, or it was a prolonged flashing of red here. But to me, there's nothing that screams that there's any issues with the water.
So we're not in the red zone, we're in a caution
Yeah.
zone.
And just to add to that, there is an increase in these right here that's already been worked into these numbers.
and that was the primary factor when I suggested we do a little more than the engineer's last recommendation, because it's been deferred, how many years? Five years. So 5-year deferrals tend to compound when you don't do it. So that was one of the reasons we wanted to try to have some corrective action this year beyond the minimum.
Okay.
And that's why it's 5% instead of 3.5%. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions? Okay, no other questions. Thank you, Mr. Alves.
Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Good job. Okay. Moving right along, budget overview presentation.
I'm gonna grab the clicker real quick.
The old clipper.
While Jewel's doing that, I'll go ahead and make a couple of introductory remarks. I know the members of the council have just received this document recently, and I know all of you have been waiting for it with bated breath, and as a lot of other folks in the community, I'm sure, are interested. I mentioned earlier the transition of my role here, and that is alluded to on page 3 of the budget document while Jewel's getting ready with her presentation. But I thought I'd go ahead and just mention that just for the public's sake. Following the resignation of the previous city manager in late January, your assistant managers took the helm, and Public Service Director, Assistant Manager Daniel Williams assumed the role of acting city manager or interim to ensure continuity. During that interim period, I have had the opportunity to work with, some of that interim period for the last 6 weeks. I've had the opportunity to work with those folks, and I applaud their efforts. But I have worked with them to try to give them advice and guidance as this budget document was put together. This is a far different experience for me than any I've ever done. I've never had to do a budget and put my name on it that I didn't have a lot longer involved, but that's not an excuse or anything else other than just a fact. But I am pleased that we made the progress we've made in the short period of time. We'll continue to collaborate and work with the city council in the days ahead to try to refine and improve. But I do stand by that this was our best effort during this period, but I congratulate your finance staff and other resources and departments in carrying forward despite the transition in leadership that we've incurred, and I applaud their efforts during the interim. With that said, I'll defer the rest of my comments that are contained in the message and so forth till later in the meeting as things come up. But I think for now, I would recommend we proceed right into the city budget overview and let Jewel lead us on that.
All right. Okay. So our first slide here shows us the budget as departments had requested on the left side by each fund, and then what the manager recommended budget is in the budget book that is before you, and the difference in each of those. In the general fund, a reduction of 6.2 million, water and sewer fund, 2.2 million, and solid waste, 38,000. The bulk of the general fund, the bulk of it is capital and personnel requests, but there are some operating and some other cost reductions in there too, and that would be the same with water and sewer. And what I'll do is I'll just go through these, and then we can go back to any, because some of them may relate, and we can go back to any of them that you may have questions about. This next one is the general fund major fund revenues, and as you'll notice, I'm trying to keep the slides to kind of the same that you see every year so that you can see how we have progressed. The top row is the actuals for fiscal year ending June 30th, 2025, and then it goes to projected through the end of this fiscal year, and then it'll show you what our projected revenue this fiscal year, the difference from 2025. So from ad valorem taxes, the projected for 26 is to be about 4.1 million above 2025. Sales tax is projected to be about 481,000 above 2025. Utility sales tax distributions, a decrease of approximately 30,000. The county district contracts increase approximately 148,000. And ambulance fees, reduction of 34,612. And then there's some notes down on the bottom, obviously, as we all know, that there was a tax reval past year. Sales tax, there's only been a small amount of, did increase a little bit, or we're projecting it to increase. Utility sales tax distributions, they have continued to decrease a little bit each year. There is a significant increase in the district contract, county collection, fire and revenue contracts for 2027, which is not shown up here, and ambulance fees.
Joel,
Yeah.
in the county district contract column, is that our fire service contract
Yes.
primarily?
It's the fire and EMS. One of the districts has rescue.
So we get a total of $1.9 million.
That was in
From-
2025. For 2026, it's 2.1, and there is a significant increase for 2027.
Do we see that number somewhere?
Not up here, it's in the budget, though.
Okay,
When we get into that, we'll point it out.
all right. Because that does seem like,
This past fiscal year.
Can we go back to, are you through?
yes, sir.
Yeah.
I was just wondering.
So the difference in ad valorem taxes from 2025 to 2026 because of the revow, that's the difference in the 14 and the 10?
Well, no, it's not all reval. We also had some growth this past year, some things that were added to the assessed value and everything.
So it's,
But bulk of it, yes.
so the bulk of it is because of the revow and then growth within the city itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference in the 10 and the 14.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
This next slide is just to kind of show the, how revenue has increased, less ad valorem tax, and how costs and expenditures have increased year over year. So on the far left-hand side, and the expenditures are on the top, and the revenues on the bottom. Tried to mark them red and green, green for revenue. Starts from 2020 to 2027, and the reason I selected 2020 is because it was following COVID that we started seeing significant inflation year over year. And so for expenditures, which is in the red, which is the top line, you'll see 2022, it spikes, but we did a refinancing that year. So if you take the refinancing out, that then brings it down to that kind of red dot that is not as bright, and kind of shows it more of a trend in line. And I didn't put the values up there, but just so you know, so between 2020 and 2020, projected 2027, expenditures have increased by $12.1 million. And all the revenues, other than ad valorem, have only increased by 3.7 million. So, you know, it shows how the city depends on that ad valorem to kind of make up the difference. Okay, so the next slide is kind of a summary of our unassigned fund balance. So the first group goes along with our fund balance policy, and the first line shows that, you know, the city's policy is 30% of total expenditures, which is expenditures before other financing uses. And the column on the left is projected for 2026, and the column on the right is for the budget 2027. So projected at the end of the year for June 30th, 2026, expect our unassigned fund balance percentage of total expenditures before other financing uses to be about 38.53%. At the end of 27 to be 36.16%. So unassigned fund balance available for appropriation is 2 million. And for 2026 and 27, 1.7 million. So unassigned fund balance is a percentage of total expenditures, which is all the operating plus all the other financing uses, which is transfers out, items like that, is 33.28% for 26, 32.81% for 27. And then third one is an additional fund balance calculation. This is one that the LGC does every year and compares us to our peers. And our fund balance available percentage as a fund balance available as a percentage of total expenditures is 43.76 for June 30th, 26, projected to be about 40.18 for June 30th, 27. And the next slide is just a snapshot. This is not all the cities in Carteret County, but some of the larger ones as comparable to Morehead, the tax rates from 2021 to 2022. And just a snapshot of all those and the 5-year increase or decrease per one, just for comparison.
So our tax rate, if we're 34.25, what's included in that? Is that only property tax?
So that is, that's proper, I mean, that's for motor vehicles also.
A motor vehicle, that's the difference. Okay,
Would you,
thank you.
are you talking about the number on the far right?
No, I'm talking about the 38 right here.
That's where that was our property tax rate in 2021.
24.
Okay.
2021.
Through 24, it stayed static at 38.
Yeah, 4 years in a
Okay.
row. Bless you.
And it was property tax and vehicle tax.
Yep, they're taxed at whatever rate we set, both, they're taxed at the same.
Thank you.
Next slide is just an example of some of the cost increases we have seen. So using some, but not all of the same examples we've used in previous years. Bulk undried salt in 2020, it was 0.0738. It's now 0.0962. It's a 30% increase. So for 2.5 million pounds, which is about the city's usage, in 2020 it cost us $184,500. Now it costs us $240,500. Difference of $56,000. Insurance citywide, in 2020, we had a cost of $492, and for 26, it's $745,000, 51% increase. Now, all that is not just rate increase, you know, some of that is additions that the city has made. So, but a bulk of it is, you know, the rates increasing. Utilities citywide, in 2020, $501,000, and 26, $826,000. We've seen a significant increase there. And the election cost in 2020 was $12,800. Election cost in 26 was $29,000. Now, for 26, we did have the extra election, so there's a couple thousand in there that is not normal. But that just to kind of, those were quick ones I could get my hands on to kind of show, you know, some of the cost increases. And this next one is just shows you how sales tax distribution, how that depends on the levy of our neighbors in the county, not the assessed value, but the levy, which, yeah, and the levy does depend somewhat on the assessed value. So the levy is the assessed value times our tax rate. So from 2020 to projected 2027, there at the end, it shows you on the top line for the each fiscal year end. And it is not, when the allocation is done, it's based on the taxes levied in the prior fiscal year. So that's why you have the second year underneath that. just to line up which year it's dependent on. And then that first row shows you the allocation rate each year from 21 to projected 27. It shows you what the city actually collected in sales tax revenue or what is projected to be collected. And then just to kind of show you the impact, positive and negative, redid those allocations based on the allocation rate from 2021. And so you see that it is a decrease, or it's the difference in negative each year. And then in 2027, as you see that we're projecting the allocation rate to go back up a little bit, we're back into the positive by about 46,000. But you can see that like a 7-year impact of that change is almost $1 million. And that is it for the budget overview. So any questions on those?
Not right now. I request the right to go back to them.
Absolutely.
It's a great overview, Jewel. Yeah, great job.
Mr. Mayor, we've been going for an hour and 15 minutes. Can we take a 5-minute?
Yeah.
If the council's okay with it?
All right, yeah, we can recess for 5 minutes. We'll, I'll say 10 minutes. We'll return at 3:21.
Thank you.
I got a horse in my throat.
So y'all do like that program?
Oh, yeah, and we're just, I think this year we're going to backwards, but that's more,
Mm-hmm.
because there's still things that we haven't really done yet that we can help with.
Oh, good, good.
Just getting into it a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah.
Each time, so, and Leanne's worked in it a lot.
She the guru right now?
Right now she is, she knows it forwards and backwards. I have to ask her, I was like, where's this? Are you talking about the rising? For, actually, we'll get some of those fairly quickly, and that has the underwriting model from prior years.
Have no idea.
Current year.
Have no idea.
That's one nice thing about it.
Not,
Notice he and Jimmy Walker was talking.
oh, is that right?
Sorry about my voice.
Where's it at? Where'd it go? Where did it go?
What you lost?
Horse ran off with it or something.
Oh, I'm leaving in a minute.
I was thinking whether we needed it or not. I'm surprised they about had it.
What? What?
I said I was gonna take a break whether we got one or not. I'm surprised you didn't take one.
Well, I hadn't got up yet. We still got,
A few minutes left.
yeah, we do.
I'm good after this. It's not too bad. Formally, the budget, but that's, we're not gonna go into that anymore. I think tonight, we'll hear comments, I'm sure. Got a rezoning. I haven't heard of controversy on it. Bill said something about he'd like to see it different, done a different way.
Kit Kat.
The way they presented it, but, no, I think he's got a suggestion. Maybe do it as a condition rather than. Other than that, it shouldn't be too hard. Of course, y'all gotta approve me if you choose to do that. Formally. What you got there? That's the watch. Oh, that's the watch. Everything else all right for you?
I've tried to work with him, but I can't do it.
Oh, he's doing all right. He's keeping me straight. Anyway, we'll do it after that. We can do it in the office.
You gotta get it.
That indicator,
Let me tell you,
I'm yours.
that is a
And man, I don't have any other commitments.
that's a
I'm
that's a
Hopefully
true
we'll get out of here.
indicator.
So.
Council won't be spending a lot, or they won't be adding a lot of services without.
I wish this would have been free.
You will look at that and say,
We have never looked at
but I'm gonna tell you, you look at that and say, look what that's gonna cost. That's gonna cost us 1 cent, that's gonna take 1 cent to do above,
Yeah, I've already eaten.
or, you know, you certainly want what you're spending.
We're looking
I don't
at
have
fire.
anything in between. If we finish early, maybe we can.
This one, look, I'm like a camel right now.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
so much.
That's why I had to go. Drinking too much food.
I want them to really dig into that and make sure that there's no doubt in his mind, he and us, we're being compensated.
Oh,
It should not be-
what we get.
It should not be on the back of our city residents. It should not.
Any service. You talking about fire? Oh, yeah, that's gonna be a deep dive.
It's gonna be, it's gotta.
Yeah, I've already talked to Courtney a little bit about it. There's probably some, I've, again, gotta get in the numbers, but I wanna justify whatever we ask. But I don't wanna wait till the budget.
Absolutely.
I told Bill in the fall.
Just think about using finance to figure out whether we want to get to his objective of an ISO rating of 1. Factor in all the costs, the fact you've got to add water supply to it. You've got to make adjustments to the 911 center. We're losing points in more areas than just manpower.
And overcoming them might not be cheap.
Maybe not be within our control. We can't make the county improve the 911 service.
Well, that'd have to be partnership.
There's just a lot that's gotta be, gotta be.
Oh, I'm ready.
Absolutely. I think it's a very, very, you know, a good tool, indicator tool.
Yep.
Certain key results.
And I'm ready.
Yeah, so what time you gonna, I'm trying to figure out
I
where.
don't agree with it.
We can go around just if we do it
AI generated.
Okay, yeah,
or
so-
afterwards.
yeah, okay.
We don't understand it.
So
We think
redundant.
we get distracted.
Hey,
I just,
but
Now,
Doug,
we can go wherever you want.
I'll go to your office if you want.
Follow
But
my-
if we do it between, that might be a good place.
That's what I was saying, I'm with you, I got you.
Or we
Okay.
do it after, depending on whatever.
Right.
I don't think everybody's gonna eat this up too much to not see any benefit. I really,
I think, no, I love it, I love it.
I thought you would.
Oh, that's right
Bill
down my
just
house.
asked me, I said, are we gonna, I want to see any more capital projects till we know what's going on.
Oh, that's perfect, that's what that's it right
Shame.
there. Before that.
Well, it had to be 2 years ago. didn't it?
they did it real happy. I've been real
That's true.
that they like the service.
Soon you, I play it by ear, we get out
Like
early,
getting their trash.
we'll play it by ear, we
They
go.
don't like it.
All right.
Never got a complaint.
Daniel, Daniel,
You need to talk to some of your neighbors.
Daniel,
I think I've knocked on as many doors as you knocked on.
are they gonna?
But I don't
Is that what they
come
gonna
to
do?
the door, ask if the rate is what it's or breaking up the call.
Okay.
We knocked on those doors
Huh?
before we did those 2 increases. Knock on those doors now.
Yeah, 'cause I
Oh,
didn't know, I didn't
but
know
now
that was
I
what to
haven't
do, you know.
gotten-
He has my number, so he has my number, okay,
Other than from David.
that's great.
But David.
I thought we already did that. Well, I don't think there'll be a problem with it.
But he owns a lot of property that I don't.
Oh, no, hell no.
So he has a lot
I'm ready
at
to
stake.
ride. What do we got here?
I hear you, just trying to do, yeah.
And I have these also.
I know what you're saying, I'm with you. Yeah, I'm getting ready to head out of town, I gotta go.
10 minutes is about up.
I went up to, I went up to DC a couple weeks ago before she passed, so now I'm going to do that.
You know,
What's that?
I figured out the
we end
event
this
to
one.
be mayor.
What's that? You get a bigger jar of candy?
Well, he gets some candy.
Yeah.
George, who was that person? Who was that person? We got a person, yeah.
I probably need this after that.
Oh, okay.
All right, y'all ready?
Right, okay.
All right. 10 minutes is up. Budget workshop, back in session. Mr. Manager?
Ready?
Yes, sir.
Ready to go, Mayor, Council? First thing, we want to give credit where credit's due. The cover of the budget this year is noted as to the creative genius of one of our folks. So I'm going to defer to Jewel on the contest that the city had to develop this beautiful cover for this year's budget. So give credit for that.
Well, I guess that creative genius would be Ian and Anna. So, as you know, we now have a public engagement software. Engage Morehead City, nc.gov is the URL. We'll plug there for anybody. In the future, there's not engagements right now, other than I think the Parks and Rec Master Plan is there. But not only did we do the budget priority pulse survey there, we also did a contest where individuals were able to submit their art and photos around Morehead City with a few parameters, and they were submitted and then combined onto this public engagement software where the public could vote for the winner of the budget book cover. And Miranda Alshire, am I saying that right? So she got the most votes and earned the spot for our budget cover contest, and that is how the cover of the budget book came to be.
Awesome. It looks great.
Okay, next item, other than the budget breakdown of the finances for each of the funds and activities on the next page, I would recognize that, that your finance department and staff did receive, for how many years now, Jewel?
For the Distinguished Budget Award, it's 3.
3 years consecutive that the city has, the staff has done the necessary due diligence and in the presentation to get the Distinguished Budget Presentation Award for the fiscal year beginning July 1 of 25. That's an excellent recognition, because one of the key things to that is presenting a budget that's can be deciphered and understood by the public. That's one of their key criteria, is a presentation that is understandably, can be challenging given the numbers and all the various areas of the budget, but I commend the city for pursuing that award and achieving it. And I believe we now have the trifecta in that the city has the 3 awards. I'd like Jewel just to remind the board and the public that we have been receiving those, some of them for quite a while.
So altogether, it makes 4, because you get the
4.
Triple Crown Award. I don't know if it's necessarily an award, but you get a Triple Crown if you have the award for your ACFR, which is the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, the PAFR, which is the Popular Annual Financial Report, and for the Budget Presentation Book.
Awesome.
So congratulations
Yep,
to the
congratulations.
city on accomplishing that. Some of those we've been getting for decades, but the newer ones, I'm really proud of the city that I had a hand in for a number of years, has achieved all of them. So congratulations to them.
And Mr. Randy, I would like for everybody to give Jules, Leanne, and the whole finance department a round of applause.
I
Yes,
certainly do.
Yeah, you guys do some amazing work. Leanne, thank you. I know you guys have worked hard on this budget along with Daniel, and it's not easy. So I just want to thank you guys for your hard work, your commitment, and dedication.
Thank you. Yeah, just to say, all the departments, because we go back and we ask a lot of questions, and they put a lot of work and thought into, and justifications into the things that they're requesting. And then finance, including Sarah and Tiffany, really go through and do a lot of projections and analysis on a lot of this stuff.
Did you say projections or rejections?
Both. Mostly projections.
With that said, thank you, Mayor, for that recognition. Well deserved.
Yes.
I did reference the manager's message. This is, I tried to be briefer than I used to be in these when some of you had to tediously read through my budget messages. I'm not going to give ages, but I also can say that this is something that Leanne and Jewel, they are very astute at putting together key bullets. And so this year I didn't get to spend a whole lot of time on it, but it does reflect my personality and my desire to say to this board and to the public that we hear you. We want to try to do everything possible to, one, inform the public of what the needs and the desires and expectations of the city government are, of what's reasonable. But we also recognize that we face some challenges, and not all of those are behind us. We still face some challenges, but particularly in the area of budgeting and finance, we have some work to do, in my opinion, to communicate as efficiently as possible and effectively as possible to the public what the needs are, and also justification for what the city's spending model is. That's why I think it was very critical that we had that presentation earlier on, that hopefully answers some of the concerns and questions about planning and the forethought that goes into budget matters that the city is undertaking, particularly when you come to the major capital expenditures and those models, and forecasting and planning and projecting as much as possible our needs going into the future. So that was a very timely presentation. I can again congratulate the Finance Department for making the necessary pursuit of that services and getting all the data entered so that we could take advantage of it in this fiscal year's budget preparations. Again, I'm not planning to read this document, but I do want to point out a few things. As noted in some of the slides that Jewel we put together, this does have a 17% reduction from all the departmental requests overall, which is significant. Now, I don't want to be critical of the requests, but obviously each department is charged with developing a budget request that they believe is necessary or reasonable for their department to meet their departmental goals and to meet the goals established by the city through the city council. However, particularly importance this year when it came to new positions and scrutiny of additional capital needs, we made a very concerted effort at the management level, again, to the degree we were able to accomplish it within the time frame that I've been here and been available to work with them, to try to keep our goal of maintaining, at least maintaining the current tax rate going into the next fiscal year, given some of the history. That was very important to me and accepted wholeheartedly by management team members to try to hit that target. Beyond that, I do want to say that I do think it would be advisable for the city with the city council involved in the process, to undertake an evaluation of service levels and needs related to those in terms of the operating costs and associated capital costs going forward, which is going to take some time. And that's going to be really challenging to make those kind of judgments under the gun in the next 30 days or so to reach conclusions on some of these items, because they're longer-term discussions that'll take some time. That's not to defer it or kick the can. That's just something that I would suggest that we, whatever happens in this budget process, we have in our mindset, this is what I'm going to recommend. It's your judgment as to whether you concur, that the city council and staff undertake an analysis of our operations to that level, particularly service levels that are desired, and this would be whether you want to increase, decrease, change direction, whatever, going forward, and that be off budget cycle prior to the budget cycle preparations for next year, which would mean that as soon as we finish, I would hope that we'll have an eye to a schedule and a dialogue that will lead to us doing that kind of evaluation well in advance of next year's cycle, which would begin sometime late in the calendar year, early part of next fiscal year, or next calendar year. So that would be my recommendation. We can talk more about that later unless some of the council members want to comment on that strategy. At this time, I certainly will defer.
Any comment?
No, I'll just make a couple, Randy, and I've shared them with you, since you come on board. I guess that is I was just talking to Councilman Taylor about it too. I mean, that's the challenge that we as elected officials, we hear, and, you know, when I ran in November, and Councilman Walker and also our mayor, you know, I think the top concern that I heard, and along with those two, is just the tax rate and wanting to cut taxes. But it comes with concern of what are you going to do in order to cut? Are you going to cut services, or are you going to cut staff? What are you going to do? Because when 1 cent equals $400,000, you've got to come up with that figure. And I hear you, and I'm not saying I don't share your concern, but again, as we go through this process, I guess we're asking for your consideration as we move forward. You know, what do we have to do to decrease? What are we going to have to do to decrease? All right. And some tough decisions are going to have to be made. And is this council going to make those decisions, or do we educate and say, okay, our citizens, this is what it's going to take. We're going to have to either, what services do you want us to decrease, or what staff level do you want to decrease? Because again, our citizens, they demand a certain level of services, and what are we going to decrease? So I guess it's just a balance moving forward with this budget. Before I got this budget, I was hoping that there was ways to decrease, and I was looking at decreasing, and I shared that with you at the very beginning. But I do understand that it does take time for you to be able to dive into this budget, and the process of seeing what services we need to look at are our staffing levels. So I think there's some challenging times ahead, and hopefully we can dive into those in the next few meetings here and see where we end up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other commission?
Any other comments? Oh, Mr. Martin, I want to say something real quick to kind of add to what Mayor Pro Tem was saying. I'm definitely happy about no increase proposal, so kudos to you guys. But I do would want to ask you guys if you could work with us to do some sort of decrease, because from campaigning, majority of the citizens I talked to, I asked them, what are your number one concern for Morehead City? And they said, Lee, is the property tax rate. And I told them I was going to do my best to honor their wishes and see if we could do some sort of decrease, even if it's just a penny, just to show them that You know, we're working to accommodate them. A lot of those citizens were elderly people living on fixed incomes. And one lady in particular, I remember she asked me to leave, why are you trying to run me out of Morehead City? Because she saw my picture on the front page of the newspaper. And I told her, I said, ma'am, I'm not trying to run you out of Morehead City. I had my reasons why I voted to pass the budget last year. But I will say this year, I would do everything in my power to try to decrease the property tax rate. She was very concerned, and I think about that little old lady and her request. And I told myself coming into this budget process that I want to work with you guys the best way we can to see if we can do some sort of decrease.
In the effort to try to accommodate the stated wishes that George and Lee has described, as council people, we've got to remember that our job is to help develop a property tax rate that is fair to the citizens and gives the city the revenue to not only cover our operating expenses that we're doing today, but to position ourselves to continue to build infrastructure. We cannot forget that the good news, bad news of being a tourist destination is that we have a lot more people to deal with on a per capita basis than a normal town of 10,000 people. And that continues to put pressure on our tax rate. I think it's wonderful that we got this tool. Truly, we need to look at some of the ideas, all of the ideas that is presented by our department. Not because they may be bad ideas. They're probably very good ideas. But it would help us focus on the total cost of providing new services. So we can do it. You know, we can find the money. But we ought to be able to communicate that to the citizens before we introduce it in a budget session. And I think that's where we're going to have to incorporate Anna and her excellent public communications program to educate. The education of why it costs and where it costs is something that I think Morehead City hadn't done as good a job as we could have done. And I think we have to really focus on it. I haven't had anybody tell me they don't like the way we collect trash, or that we pick up vegetation on the street, or that we resurface, patch the roads. You know, we haven't had that. But I do have a legitimate question. Can we afford to do an ISO 1 rating in the fire department? And what is the total cost of that? Because it can be extremely expensive. So we have to be more selective as money becomes more of a dear resource, and educate the customer. Okay, we can give you that. Well, let me tell you, that may be more expensive than this other option that we'd like you to think about. So I think we got a big education road ahead of us, George and Lee. I really do. I don't think we waste money, but we don't always explain the need.
Okay. Any other comments?
If not, I'll continue. Thank you for that feedback. I've heard some of those comments directly from individuals, but I think it's good that we collectively state our case, if you will, as we go forward to the public, so, and to the staff and others. so that the messaging is not misunderstood. As noted in the earlier information, this budget as proposed, is slightly over $42 million. That's for all funds. That includes your utility funds and the enterprise funds, as well as the solid waste fund. The biggest chunk of it, of course, is the general fund. That's almost $30 million of that 42. But overall, I am encouraged that we're able to recommend a decrease from the prior year funding or the current year funding, which would be the prior year to this proposed budget, by nearly 3%, by making adjustments and cost efficiencies, and with the growth of revenue sources to some degree in certain areas. Net is a decrease of just under 3%, which is encouraging. I'm not sure that'll necessarily be a trend, but given some of the challenges, economic challenges that the nation and community and state face right now with growing cost in several areas, that is an encouraging factor that despite that, we're able to recommend this to you.
Mr. Martin, can you
Yes, sir.
elaborate on that 3%?
Yeah, it's just under 3%, and I think it's broken down. Jewel, you might want to hit the highlights of how that's broken down.
Yeah, just
By
for
fund.
the public, for educating?
It's 3% on the all funds. I think you had that in one of your.
And if not, you can bring it back.
While she's looking for that, I'll proceed. Your water and sewer fund is just under 11 million of that total, and of course, the sanitation fund comprises the balance of 1.3 million. But in the general fund, and since that seems to be a topic of significant interest, the two primary funding sources we have for revenues that are that come to the city to offset those costs associated with the general fund activities. The general fund, as you know, is most of our services, and they're the ones that do not generate a lot of revenue. They're by design things such as police, fire EMS, parks and recreation, which we might have some small fees in some of these areas, but those are the primary sources of where we spend money for all the different services. Streets were mentioned, and various other items that go within the general fund. The enterprise funds are the water, sewer, and sanitation, where people are paying fees for those, so we tend to block those out, but they are obviously very important services to our citizens and to a community this size. In particular, in the general fund, two of the main sources that fund almost 75% or 3/4 of the cost associated with general fund operations are the ad valorem property taxes and the sales taxes. Jules already mentioned what the ad valorem is generated by property that is built or developed or owned within the city in terms of real estate and houses and buildings and all of those type things. And then we have certain portion of our budget is from the vehicles and other equipment type things that individuals own. As you can see, from a property taxpayer standpoint, they believe a heavy burden is carried, and that's accurate for their share of the property tax that is paid to the city to support all these general fund services. By contrast, you have rental property owners who contribute through the vehicle ownership, just like everybody else. All people are pretty much equal there. But when it comes to the homes that those folks reside in, they're being paid by developer interests or by the owners of the apartments or wherever they might be renting, or if it's a home that they're renting, the homeowner is responsible. So there is a disparity naturally in the system for who pays what, but that is the system that is codified by the General Assembly and the way that we are required to levy those kind of costs. I think it's incumbent on the city, as we talked about previously, in a discussion to make sure that we do not impose a burden on any group of taxpayers that's unfair comparatively to their peers and other users of the system. And that's why you have your water and sewer and your sanitation built pretty much as user fees. And that's the biggest distinction when you come to this kind of thing. And I'm saying most of this because this board knows it, but for the public's consumption as well. But with 75% of the funds, and roughly the ad valorem tax is obviously the bigger bulk of that. I think it's over half of our revenues, or roughly half, if I remember correctly, come from that in that fund. But the sales tax is paid by everyone, so that's more of an equitable tax, if you will, based on consumer services and goods and purchases and things. And that's distributed, collected by, and distributed through the state model, and then the county distributes it within the county to the municipals and keep a share for the county. That one grows basically based very clearly tied to the economic conditions. If spending is up, sales tax is likely up, and so the distributions go accordingly. But the way the state allows them to distribute those, the county gets to make the choice of whether it's distributed based on the ad valorem tax levy share that each municipality imposes, or it's based on population. In our county, historically, it's been based on ad valorem taxes, and I don't know of any effort to switch. It typically, in all fairness to the counties, is determined based on what's most advantageous to the counties, since they get to make that decision, and I don't blame them for that, but that is the way our system is set up. For the city to deviate, these are two things that, one, we don't control, the sales tax. The only way that changes if the General Assembly authorizes a new sales tax levy or an additional sales tax or an increase in the sales tax is allowed within the state law. I believe we heard last week at the League Conference of City Vision that the General Assembly has not authorized a tax increase of that nature in at least a decade. So seeing any foreseeable change in the sales tax is not likely. It's only going to be driven by the economic conditions and the spending of folks. I'm not trying to do an extensive tutorial here, but I think it's very important that we understand this. The public, going to the point made by the council that we need through our PIO to disseminate as much good, useful information to the public to educate them on how this process really works. But the property tax is the one that is left to local government discretion in setting the rate. The valuation of property, which is an integral function, as this board learned during revaluation, and it helps in a great deal determine the kind of revenues and how the impact of the tax rate is on property owners. That's driven by the value of the property and the sales. That's a circumstance or a process that the state has established and is uniform across the state on various classifications of real estate property on how they value it based on sales in this area. So I won't go any deeper on that. We can have a lengthier discussion about that as time goes on, but I don't think we need to forget that, because the average property value, I think average tax value was around $500,000, if I remember correctly, when we were doing this budget presentation in Morehead City. By comparison, some units of government not too far away have a valuation that's 40% of that. So, you know, it's quite a difference, and that reflects usually in how their tax rate comparatively stands against a rate in Morehead City that you've already had reviewed. But without getting too deep in the weeds on that, one point I did want to make is the way the distribution of sales tax is very critical to the city's operations. And if the county has chosen and consistently agreed that it's based on your ad valorem levy, I just point out that any change in your levy, up or down, impacts your sales tax, which is your second largest revenue source. So if you cut the tax rate, you can presume, as Jewel just pointed out, the cycle, a year later, you're going to see a reduction in your sales tax as a result of that. Conversely, if you have a rate change and your peers do not have a rate change or they go lower, then the city might see growth in the sales tax because its share would be a bigger piece of the pie, if you will, in that analogy, out of the county's share, total share for it and all the municipalities to distribute for sales tax. I apologize for that detail, but hopefully some people will see some benefit with that. And when you look at the growth and or lack of it in certain categories in our revenues, that's the reality of how the process works. But that's not to take away from any discussion, healthy discussions we have going forward on modifications to this rate. This is just a proposal. I want to make sure the public understands that. The city council determines the final budget. City council determines what the tax rate's going to be, and through their actions, through your actions. The staff is just taking a shot at trying to put together a responsible budget plan that meets the basic needs and so forth. In doing that, we did not fund any additional personnel with the lone exception of a modification from a part-time to full-time in HR based on workload needs, but it's not a net increase in our full-time equivalents across the board. So that's another sign that we're trying to be really conservative. We had several positions requested, and those are detailed, but as council member already pointed out, it's certainly incumbent on the council to be aware of what the future needs will be and for you to evaluate those and whether they're responsible and should be funded. But at this point, this is the way we've approached this budget. I won't belabor the general fund, but with any additional comments, except to say that the other funding sources are very limited, and those categories typically don't grow at a very high rate. You'll have spikes in vehicle, the values of vehicles do change over time, but that is part of that property tax equation that you need to keep in mind. Because it is, when you apply it to those equipment and vehicle items, that's the one area that pretty much everybody is equal across the city. Unfortunately, there's only one levy, one rate, and it applies to everything equitably, including the households and so forth, under the current model that the General Assembly has in place. I think it is incumbent for the public to also be aware, and reminder to this board, and we heard a good deal about this in Raleigh last week, the value of the property tax model is currently being greatly scrutinized at the state level. There's quite a bit of debate and uneasiness among local government officials, counties and cities, that the model that's been in place for decades, essentially, with only minor tweaks, is being considerably dissected and reviewed, and the legislature has not reached any conclusions, but there is a very strong likelihood that some changes will be forthcoming, impacted by potential legislation that could pass this short session over the next few weeks. Time will tell. But I won't go through all those different options, but the thing that is unnerving to me as 4 decades of doing these kind of budgets is, if that is our strongest source of revenue for the general fund, we can't impose fees on everything in the general fund. Critically, I don't think we can impose very much at all in terms of fees that would be impactful on the overall budget. We could have increases in small areas, but it comes back to the discussion we were having earlier, that it could greatly impact on our ability to do the services that we're currently providing, particularly those we're not mandated to provide, to determine what is a fair level of funding and how we're going to raise the revenue without additional sources being authorized by the General Assembly. if they greatly limit local government's ability to raise the tax rate in any shape, form, or fashion, the city's going to be locked at a current level of funding, and you've already heard discussion about how that could be impactful on the budget going forward. So enough said on that, but we'll keep you informed as to what we hear out of the General Assembly. But they in North Carolina control that dynamic. We can only lobby and request consideration, but that decision will be made by the state. And if it is not favorable to local governments, then I don't know what the next source of revenue to replace would be, and that means the only other option is to cut. And so that's not a situation that any of us have faced in my career, where we saw economic downturns which were impactful on a lot of costs and so forth. Property values did decrease at least one reval period during my career here, and we adjusted accordingly. But if you take away our ability to adjust, ours being the local government's ability to levy the tax rate unimpeded other than by general guidelines and maximum rates and things like that, which we're nowhere near, that will be very impactful going forward. So I don't want to preach anymore. I'll leave that to you guys that are much better at that than me. But I do want to say it's been my genuine pleasure to work with your excellent staff and help put my stamp on this presentation that you have before you, that we can spend as much time going through. I know each of you have already done your due diligence, but going back before I leave it, I do want to point out that in the water and sewer rate fund, I have had a meeting with assistant manager and the public services director, and I met with the engineer and got I got an update on where the city has been with its various fees and rates and charges related to water and sewer service. The city is in an excellent position. That is one area that you're probably not hearing complaint, because in my assessment throughout the area and statewide, this city is well positioned in terms of its rates are lower in most cases on those utility services, and yet we're getting a quality service and we have excellent infrastructure. We just have some additional needs to expand and improve that infrastructure, as was alluded to earlier. But we don't have staring us down that multi-million-dollar need for new plant here or expansion there that would really jeopardize our ability to keep our rates affordable. But when you look at the total package of cost associated with homeownership or living in Morehead City, I hope people will look beyond just the property tax, because there are other considerations. But this year, based on the recommendation, there is identified a need to stay in good financial condition, and you saw it on the charts that were alluded to earlier in the presentation. We need to beef up our revenue that we're receiving in the water and sewer fund. So we'll talk more about that as these discussions go on, unless there's a question. Solid waste is primarily done through contractual relationship, third party, but there are some associated capital costs for our yard waste collection that was mentioned as a service that's well thought of in the community, and other considerations. Then you come to capital outlay. That's the big discussion. We'll go into more in depth as the budget process goes on that. But I'll stop and answer any questions, and then defer to Jewel on any items that she wants to point out that she would bring to your attention as we go forward in these other sections. And then, of course, answer any questions. Mayor, I think we're planning to be out of here within an hour, so that you'll have ample time to prepare before the next meeting at 5:30. So I rest my case for tonight.
Okay. Jewel?
I really don't have anything today to add, because we didn't want to just, hound you with a bunch of data and not leave time for questions or whatever, so I'll
Okay.
save all my stuff for the next workshop.
Okay.
Is there any need to go to page 27 of the budget book which talks about our strategic plan. We met in December, and I think we reviewed these in quite a bit of detail. The question would just be a simple, are we still satisfied with these objectives?
Yes, and I marked, so what I did is I went through the minutes from those sessions. I removed items that, by council as a whole, definitely wanted removed during those sessions. Updated some other things from those sessions, mostly the items that 3 or more council members had, spoke in favor of. So, and they're all marked with a red arrow. Basically the additions or any modifications. There's not a lot, because, first year is a big year, and then every year you just kind of modify it each year going forward. So,
And our budget reflects these as we've got them presented in the book.
yes.
And I wasn't a party to those discussions, but I think when we do this service level discussion that I recommended earlier, assuming we pursue that for looking with an eye to the future on budget needs and budget adjustments, I think that might be a good opportune time to revisit any of these that the board has additional thoughts on. I wasn't privy to being there and in that discussion, but I have started listening to those discussions. And hopefully I'll be better informed when we do have those conversations about some of the challenges and needs and desires of this council.
And if you want me to just summarize them at a high level, the changes, I can. If you want me to go through that real quick
You talking about
on the strategic plan.
Strategic plan.
I think it'd be good,
Okay.
if we got time, for next, whatever the mayor and the manager.
I'm fine
Do
with
we
it.
have time, manager?
I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
The board's,
So you'll see there's a couple of items in here, S2, and I don't want to have to flip back and forth on y'all a bunch, but it's S2 in a couple of places, and maybe one other. It talks about engaging electus to assist us in speaking with the legislator and gaining funding, or whether it be assistance with downzoning, things like that. So that's one of the new things you'll see in here as a modification. That along with downzoning, and then also you'll see it kind of listed with additional funding from not only the state, but federal and everything else as it goes along with some of our major capital projects or programs, W.S. King, items like that. We had talked about doing the 2-year in the second, doing a 2-year budget with the second year, this budget year being 28, being kind of a projection of that year. So that's obviously done. It's in this book. We talked about the investment and debt policy. That's in here. We had quite a bit of discussion dealing with the Parks and Rec master plan, and that's going forward. We had a lot of discussion on looking at positions, staffing levels, and shifts, identifying efficiencies and cost. That's been updated in here. That's an S3. There was quite a bit of talk about, our water and sewer infrastructure, not only water and wastewater treatment and, water treatment and all that on both ends of the city to support growth that is happening now and also to support growth that is happening in the future. So there's a couple of elements of that in a few places. So I'm going off memory, so I can't tell you exactly what page, because I'm not trying to read every
33.
single one of them to you.
that's on 33. And adding the whales.
And there's on 34, you'll see it also. And then again, there's on 34 is about the seeking funding, speaking with, our legislators to continue to assist us as they have definitely done in the past. There's some additions for ADA compliance plan on here. slight modification to the Citizens Leadership Academy. And basically, instead of implementing, it's continue and enhance, and then there's a slight change to the name. And I think I have hit them all. Yes,
Okay.
in summary, yep.
Now, Jules, on page 32, initiative 25-S3-6.2, line library services under Parks and Recreation for improved supervision, efficiency, and effectiveness. Super great idea. With that being said, I just wanted to ask, do you guys think it would be more efficient if we move all library services at the W.S. King at the W.S. King building, excuse me, because we're doing the renovation project and we're expanding that facility, do you think we will have adequate space to move all library services there?
I think that is definitely something, worth discussing, especially, times of the year, especially summer camp and some of the programs there, some of the same age children are going to the library, being able to combine some of those. We would definitely need to have like a conversation as a group, because I'm not as familiar with the capacity after renovation and the continued use as, Daniel or Jessica may be. But I think that is definitely a conversation worth having.
Okay.
Yeah, and I need to catch up on that one because I haven't been involved in those discussions, but I am definitely interested in listening.
Okay. Council have any questions? Councilman Walker? Councilman Abel? Councilman Taylor? You guys have any questions?
And if there's any that you guys remember that maybe I missed, let me know. But I think I hit all the highlights, and as you'll notice, there's quite a few items that are no longer there.
Okay.
I would like to ask a little different question. When you think about this budget year that we're nearing the end of, we have been extremely successful in getting grant revenue to help us with our capital needs. What do you guys think is the outlook for that this coming year? And should we think about redoubling or directing into more different avenues, looking for some of our capital needs in the interim budget period?
But I would say that Kelly keeps her eye out for things all the time. I know she's been working with IT on one there. And actually, a lot of our staff, I would say all of our staff, keeps an eye out. Kristen's even looking at one for assistance in, with the personnel policy to have a good thorough review and have a grant pay for that. The outlook, and you may want to jump in here, I'm not exactly sure with some of the budget talks and everything at the state level, kind of waiting to see how, that plays out. I think that'll be a good indicator of maybe what's going to happen forward there. But as far as continuing to look, or if the request is to ask us to look for more grants, we're looking at everything we can, I guess I'm trying to say, without having a person that's what they're doing all the time.
Think about doing this past year. Chris came to us and said, we have to service that debt. It's a reimbursement process.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have the working cash. So please, we're not going to promote or encourage going out and asking for more above what we had at this present level. If we were to cut our property tax rate, would we decrease the amount of money that would help us fund the cash flow needs of increasing our emphasis on grants?
Well, if you're decreasing the expenditures by the same, not necessarily. If you're decreasing,
If you're looking for more grants, you wouldn't be decreasing, you'd be increasing.
well, you said if we decreased our property tax rate, would we be decreasing the amount of money that we could fund in the interim? And I would say it would stay about the same because you're gonna do your expenditures, by about the same rate. And I had at the top of my head, but we have actively been looking, still for grants and for large ones. I will say the biggest one as far as the outflow of our money and the amount of time it takes to get reimbursed was the one with Encore. And a lot of that just, had to do with that just being kind of a temporary agency. But a lot of the state grants, for instance, you can report in on a quarterly basis and get reimbursed. So you're not hanging out there, and they do it all the time, so those don't go out on as long as far as being out your own cash.
Okay.
Yeah.
The one prohibition, or I would caution against, is if you were to consider using any of the reserves for repeat expenses, operating expenses, you certainly shouldn't do that. That would be what would damage the ability to fund those things if you lower our reserves, particularly if you get near that policy minimum that this board has wisely established. The closer you get to that, the less flexibility you have, because those dollars are significant for some of these grant programs. To add what Jewel was commenting on, latest updates from the state, it's anybody's guess as to what's going to happen with the state budget process and when. Sooner or later, I'm sure they'll figure something out, but I was not encouraged unless the mayor or Mayor Pro Tem got a different message that we can expect a state budget resolution timely. That just doesn't look like it's guaranteed by any stretch. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see this session, the short session, end without a budget again. And that's not just next year's, this is the current year. And so they're already talking about continuing resolutions and other options to keep funding programs that are in process. But I was encouraged by the delegation information that I've heard of. We're well represented at the state level and the federal level, and they're on top of it, and they've kept our staff informed. And so I feel good about our chances if and when the state budget gets resolved and the allocations that are within their budgetary discretion. Hopefully we'll see some action on the request the city's made. On the federal level, with the community project funding and so forth, there are obviously categories of funding that are important and the ones that get most of the money and that the city would likely really qualify for. I see our biggest benefit there likely going forward in the utility area. And I think we've got to make a strong case and be ready to really press our delegation to make sure we get our fair share of the funding from this congressional district and statewide pots of money for our critical needs, because that's one way we can stay low on our utility rates or in the category we're in, if we're able to satisfy some of these big capital needs that are particularly mentioned in here, the utility extensions, particularly on the west end, where we have some challenges meeting future growth demands based on the information that the assistant manager has shared with me on that and discussions with the engineer. That's where we really could use some assistance. And those go through, the federal agencies, and Jewel and her staff are very adept at making sure we do meet our obligations and we do them timely so that those funds get released as quickly as possible under the state budget cycle. But there's no doubt we do have to front the money, and we're going to continue to have to do that. And we've got to have a financial plan that manages our resources so that we can meet that, because those no match particularly, some of them have small matches, but no match, no interest, they're not a loan, they're a grant. Those are the ones we want, and we need to be ready to pursue them with vigor.
One of the big advantages, if you're going to look for a grant, is to have it shovel-ready.
Correct.
The engineering done for that. In our budget, have we left some money that we can pay for some engineering and try to get ourselves positioned to take advantage of the grants as soon as they are announced?
Jewel's gonna give a shot, and Daniel will support if he needs to.
For water and sewer infrastructure, yes, there's definitely funds there, because we know we have, for engineering.
Let's pick on the library.
Mhm.
You know we want to do something with the library. We're at the critical junction that either we got to spend a ton of money to remodel what we've got and make it habitable for a greater number of people, or build a new one on our campus here. Do we have the flexibility to do that, to begin to plan that process?
Not at this moment, there's nothing budgeted currently. You know, there's always the opportunity as things, you know, the end of the year, if something comes in, you know, above what we've projected, not even above revenue, because our fund balance is based on our projections for this year, but something comes in even above that, then that could be possibly some money we can set aside for that.
I would like to take a shot at that with legislative or congressional funding that wouldn't require us to have it shovel-ready. If opportunity pops up this year, I would definitely like to have a discussion about that, because I think that would ring strong with the state and federal resources. We just have to find the right place, and our consultant likely, our lobbyist could likely assist. And I applaud the city for engaging a very well-qualified lobbyist. I haven't met him yet, but Jewel's setting up a discussion soon for us to pursue some of these kind of ideas. So if you have other thoughts on that, please let us know.
Yeah, I certainly agree, Mr. Randy, and to refer to, on page 33, to refer to initiative 25-S4-4.2, just to piggyback off of what Councilmember Taylor was saying, engage the municipal campus annex expansion plan. So I know we passed that in the budget last year, last June, to approve of the debt service for the city hall annex. But I've been hearing from different council members, like, different visions for that project. Some council members have expressed that they don't want to go forward with the project, and others are saying differently. So I want to hear from council about their vision for that project going forward.
Where is it in the process? Can Daniel or Joel? I know Randy.
I think
I know
Daniel's
Randy
waiting
can.
on some time capacity in order to do that one, wrap up some of these other larger projects.
I mean, how much money was appropriated in last year's budget for that?
A little bit over 100,000.
Yeah, just seed money. I've gotten a high-level view from the staff, but I'll defer to Daniel or Jewel if they want to comment further right now. Maybe a discussion we need to have at one of these goal-setting, or well, not necessarily goal-setting, but at one of these service-level things, because that's going to be critical, particularly while we're pursuing grant funding. That might be critical to whether you do it or not. To me, that would be one that would be ideal if you can get grant funding. Otherwise, all we can do is run that model and show you the impact on tax rate and other factors if we pursue it without grant funding. That'd be a good tool.
But that's where, correct me if I'm
actually in the
wrong,
model.
Joel or
It's already
Daniel.
in, it's already in.
Even though the seed money's there, I just thought it was always remaining there, but there's been no planning or discussion in this year's budget. Is that correct to say? I think we've had other priorities. Yes.
And maybe there's some additional ideas about what you could use that space for that might free up space elsewhere.
Yes.
We've had a little bit of discussion about that.
Yeah. How much of that project would be paid for by the water and sewer fund?
50%.
50%? That's good.
Yeah.
That helps.
And it was my understanding, I guess, that, that would house the library and obviously part of your, department, is that correct?
All of this department.
Okay. Right. Okay.
But there may be some other ideas. You know, we could shuffle the deck and see where it lands where.
But I would certainly want us to try to maximize our grant opportunity
I agree.
at this time of budget woe.
Yeah, that would certainly delay, but it would be a delay well worth it if we're successful in accruing funds from another taxing authority.
Yeah, that's why I was kind of leaning to with the possibility of moving the library to the W.S. King building to see if that would be the most cost-effective thing to do.
Certainly look at it.
Yep. Okay.
But that would still require some type of addition to W.S. King, wouldn't
It depends on,
it? Yeah.
yeah.
Unless you're gonna
If
convert
you're
use.
using the new section for the basketball court, and we filled it up, and we kept the old section for weights and exercise rooms and stuff, I think we've utilized that building. So either way, I think if you move the library, you're looking at some type of building adjustment somewhere.
Some modification of something.
Yeah, it's gonna take a capital commitment,
Yeah.
one way or the other, one building or
Well,
another.
let's just go a different direction. Daniel, have we done any kind of cost analysis or improvements if we were to keep the library where it is and keep the municipal building? Do we have anything, any kind of improvement cost? Have we got anything that tangible that we could see that's been done on that building? Right. But are those costs in this year's budget we're operating in, or are there any costs associated with the next year's budget? And can you say again what we were, the stucco on the outside and? It's a repairing kind. Okay, okay.
No new anything, just repairing stuff, paint, fixing rod, fixing doors.
And that outside cost, the exterior only was, I believe, Daniel gave us a figure several years ago of $50,000. But now, you know, with inflation, it's more than that.
Yeah.
To make it handicapped and square away some of the problems on the interior of the building, basic money was in the $1 million range, because you're basically going to build another building to rearrange the floors and make it handicap friendly and redo the electric and redo the plumbing. It's extremely expensive to remodel that building in its existing format.
It is.
For a use
building.
that wasn't designed for.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true.
And God knows, moving some of the walls, remember, the jail in that thing is built in steel.
I remember when we remodeled it the last time, we ran into some surprises.
Yeah, we just covered it up with sheetrock.
And we found Richard's old office.
You did.
And excuse me, you guys, Councilmember Walker asked to be excused. So that was at 4:23 PM, Sean, that he left. Just wanted to tell you that for your records. Okay, we can continue.
Well, but what I was referring to, and not trying to be cryptic, I haven't been involved in all those discussions, but given some history, obviously that's a very significant building in the history of Morehead City. And that tugs at my heart and so forth. But when it comes to the business side of it, I think we have to really look at all options and where is the best place for that facility to be. That property and building have a lot of value. It is in a prime location with the water not far away. So, but as Bill pointed out, there's some other complications with regard to the property, and so I think we need to take a long, hard look at that and any other options that are out there, and determine what is the best case going forward. But I would not recommend we rush to judgment on what we're going to put where until we take that broader look and
I think you have to take a brand-new, fresh look.
I
at
think
this.
so.
Absolutely.
Particularly with the additional information that the property next to us didn't include all that we thought.
Yeah.
And we'd have to move the existing generator, we'd have to do something different with our handicap ramp. You know, I think we have to assume that none of that is valid anymore because of the cost and start fresh again.
I would concur. The other thing is, in looking at this campus, I've been made aware that it's a beautiful building, great place that the city built here. I had a hand in acquiring the property, and that was the end of this part of the building. We looked at the old building as a potential. I guess looking back, the only advantage the old building would have had, I think it had more square footage.
8,000 square feet.
Yeah, it had more square footage, so maybe we'd have less need and more options, but we'd have had a whole lot different cost if we had tried to renovate that building when it got around to renovation versus this. So I applaud the city's move in building this structure. I certainly don't think it's foolish to consider any additions, but I do want to remind the board, based on what I've been told, we're really tight in space here. We didn't overbuild by any stretch of the imagination for office needs and other needs of the city. And, you know, that's evidenced by the construction that's going on across the side street here to meet some of those needs. But I think that's the look that I'd rather see the city take, a comprehensive review of those areas and factor the library discussion into that, other potential uses at W.S. King or whatever, and the municipal building be a part of the discussion. And I know the city had to think long and hard probably and went through a difficult process from what I read afar with regard to the former city hall where the old post office was. But I applaud you making that move when you did. And this one may follow a similar track if we do it right. But, you know, we can, rather than rush to judgment, I think we really need to take a step back and look at all of it.
I'm probably gonna get some looks with this comment I'm gonna make, but that's okay.
Go ahead, George.
I mean, you know, me and the mayor had an opportunity to go on a mobile workshop in Raleigh. And, you know, it's amazing what other communities can do with a historical building to keep it, especially a historical building within their city. And, here we are talking about the municipal building. And I hope in that discussion that we would look and see what we can do to keep that building. I mean, it is, you know, the oldest building, I would say, in Morehead City left. And, you know, I just don't want to be real easy to demolish it or to demo it. I think it's something that we should hold on to and it be part of the discussion. And if it's not fit for a library, maybe it's for something else that we could house in that. So I tried to save the building here, Mr. Martin, but I got outvoted. But that's
I read about it. I read about it.
I did, and but
followed that.
I know the cost would have been significant. And just like when we built the police station, we tried to remodel the cafeteria, and what did we end up doing? It was cheaper to demo the old cafeteria building than to build what we have. So I understand that it's all associated with cost, but again, there is a lot of historical significance with the municipal building. And if other municipalities and other cities can do it, I don't know why Morehead City can't at least restore that building and keep it within our city.
Yeah, particularly if you can determine what's a suitable use in it. Maybe it's not a library, maybe it is. I don't know. I want to get into that discussion.
But I hope that's part of the discussion, and I'm glad you're here to help us with it.
Well, I look forward to it.
Thank you, Mr. Randy. I want to go ahead and throw this out there. It's 4:30 p.m. If you guys want to go ahead and end here, and we'll just come back next Tuesday at 2 p.m. That'll give us about an hour between this meeting and our city council meeting at 5:30, if council is agreeable to it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm okay with it.
I
Okay.
move we adjourn.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and adjourn this meeting. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.